The wagon wheel cracked clean in half on a Tuesday afternoon in the autumn of 1874, and Abigail Baker decided right then and there that the universe had a personal grudge against her. She had been making good time on the trail west of Redemption Creek, Kansas, the flat brown earth rolling out ahead of her team of two bay horses like a promise she wasn't sure she trusted. The sun was still high enough to be fierce, burning the back of her neck where her bonnet didn't quite reach, and the load in the wagon bed, all the earthly possessions of a 26-year-old widow, which amounted to considerably less than anyone might hope, shifted and rattled with every rut in the road. She had been telling herself it was fine, that she was fine, that a woman who had already buried a husband and outlasted a drought and packed up an entire life into a single wagon had no business being rattled by a rough patch of Kansas trail. Then the right rear wheel hit a half-buried stone, and the spoke gave way with a sound like a rifle shot, and the whole corner of the wagon dropped hard into the dirt, and Abigail Baker sat on the buckboard with the reins slack in her hands and stared at the horizon, and said one single word that her mother had spent considerable effort making sure she would never say. She climbed down, walked around the back of the wagon, and crouched beside the ruined wheel. The iron rim had separated from the wood. Two spokes were completely gone. The hub had cracked along a grain line that had probably been waiting to fail for years. Her late husband Thomas had always said the wagon was good for another decade. Thomas had also said the wheat crop would come in fine, and that their neighbor Harold Briggs was an honest man, and a great many other things that had turned out to be completely wrong. She stood up. The horses shifted in their traces, stamping with mild irritation. The prairie spread out in every direction, enormous and indifferent, the tall grass moving in a slow wind that smelled like dust and sage. There was no town behind her for 6 miles. There was no town ahead of her for at least 8 more. The spare wheel she had been carrying was adequate for a front axle replacement, but the rear assembly was a different fit, and she had known that and had been meaning to do something about it before she left Redemption Creek, and she had not done something about it, and now here she was. She was still standing there, hands on her hips, calculating her options with the grim arithmetic of a woman who had learned to calculate everything, when she heard hoofbeats coming up the trail from the south. She turned and watched the rider come. He was on a dark roan horse, a good animal moving at an easy lope, and even from a distance she could read the posture, the slight forward lean, the loose shoulders, the way his hat was pulled low against the afternoon glare. A man who spent most of his life in the saddle, a drifter, she thought. The trail west of Redemption Creek saw its share of them, men moving through like weather, belonging nowhere in particular and headed somewhere that might not exist. She had learned, living on the edge of the Kansas frontier for 3 years, that most of them were harmless and a few of them were not, and that the trick was telling the difference quickly. He slowed as he approached, reading her situation before she had to say a word. His eyes went to the collapsed corner of the wagon, to the broken wheel, to the spare she had tied to the wagon's side, and then back to her face. She watched him make all these assessments without hurry, the way a careful man reads a landscape before he rides into it. He pulled up about 10 yards away and touched the brim of his hat. "Ma'am, I didn't ask for help," she said, because she had found that establishing this early saved a great deal of confusion. "No, ma'am, you did not," he agreed pleasantly. He swung down from the roan with an ease that spoke of 10,000 dismounts, looped the reins loosely around his saddle horn, and walked toward the broken wheel with his eyes still on it and not on her, which she noted. He crouched where she had crouched, turning his head to look at the hub crack, then straightening up to examine the rim separation. "That spare you're carrying is a front axle width," he said. "I know what it is. You've got some of the hub left. Crack's not all the way through on the top half." He touched the wood with one finger, pressing gently. "If you've got wire in that wagon, something heavy gauge and a piece of hardwood, even an axe handle would do, I can brace it well enough to get you to the next town." "You're going to fix my wheel," she said, making it a statement and not quite a question, and with an edge in it that most men would have noticed and retreated from. He did notice. He stood up and looked at her directly for the first time, and she got a proper look at him. He was perhaps 30 years old, maybe a year or two either side, with a face that the sun and the wind had worked on considerably. Dark brown hair gone a little long under the hat. Eyes the color of creek water over limestone, a kind of clear gray-green that caught the light in a way she found momentarily distracting. A jaw that needed a razor's attention. He was wearing a plain canvas coat, worn at both elbows, and his boots were good leather but old. Everything about him said a man who owned very little and kept what he owned in working order. "I was going to fix your wheel," he said. "Unless you'd rather I didn't." There was no challenge in his voice, no condescension. He wasn't asking for her gratitude or her permission exactly. He was simply stating what he intended to do and leaving the door open for her to close it. She considered closing it. She had gotten very good, these past 2 years since Thomas died, at not needing people. It was a skill that kept her functional but occasionally left her standing alone on a broken wagon in the middle of the Kansas prairie. "There's wire in the box behind the seat," she said, "and a hatchet. I don't have an axe handle, but there's a length of oak I've been meaning to use for fence repair." He nodded once, already moving, and she watched him go to the back of the wagon and locate things with efficient competence, not rummaging or making a mess, just finding what he needed and bringing it back to the wheel. He worked without talking, which she respected. She had known men who narrated their own labor as if the audience required constant entertainment. This man simply worked, and the work was good. She could see that even without knowing everything about wheel repair. His hands knew what they were doing. She stood nearby for a while, then decided that standing and watching was a particular kind of uselessness she didn't enjoy, and climbed up to check on the load in the wagon bed, retying a rope that had come loose on the corner of her cedar chest, tucking the oilcloth more firmly around the crate that held her good dishes, the ones that had been her grandmother's and had survived the trip out from Ohio 3 years ago and were not going to be rattled to pieces now. The dishes made her think of Ohio, and Ohio made her think of her mother, who had written to her twice since Thomas died, and both letters had contained the same message in different arrangements of words. "Come home, Abigail. There is nothing left for you there. Come home." And both times Abigail had sat at the small table in the farmhouse kitchen and read the letters and thought about Ohio, about its green hills and its decent roads and its absolute certainty that Abigail Baker's place in the world was somewhere that someone else had already decided for her, and she had folded the letters and put them in the cedar chest and written back, "I am fine, Mama. I am staying." She was not, perhaps, entirely certain why she was staying. The farm had been sold to pay Thomas's debts. Harold Briggs had seen to that with the kind of cheerful efficiency that made her want to put her fist through a wall. The money left over was enough to get her to Colorado, where her father's cousin had a homestead claim and had written to say there was work and land to be had. It was not much of a plan, but it was her plan, and she had made it herself, and that counted for something. The man with the creekwater eyes worked for about 40 minutes on the wheel. She came back to stand near him as the afternoon shadows lengthened and watched the repair take shape. The wire wrapped tight in a figure pattern around the cracked hub, the oak brace notched and fitted with a precision that surprised her, the rim eased back into contact with the wood and seated as firmly as hand tools would allow. When he was done, he tested the wheel by pressing his full weight against the rim from different angles, watching the brace hold. "It'll get you to Carver's Ford," he said. "Don't push the horses above a walk and go easy on ruts if you can read them ahead of time. The repair's solid, but it's a repair, not a wheel. How far is Carver's Ford?" 11 miles. "I thought it was 8. Trail bends after the creek crossing. It's 11 by the road." He began gathering the extra wire, coiling it neatly, and returned it to the box behind the seat. He washed his hands with a short pour of water from his canteen and dried them on his trousers. "You didn't ask," she said. He looked at her. "My permission," she said. You just started fixing it. He considered this. You needed the wheel fixed, he said finally. Seemed like the important part. It was exactly the kind of answer that should have annoyed her and instead did not, and she was not entirely sure what to do with that. She looked at him and he looked back at her with a directness that was not aggressive, just honest, the way you looked at something you wanted to understand. I'm going through Carver's Ford myself, he said. I'll ride alongside if you don't object in case the brace needs adjusting. She thought about objecting. She decided not to. I'll be starting in about 10 minutes, she said. I need to water the horses first. He nodded and went back to his roan, and she took her horses to the small creek that ran 20 yards off the trail, and she thought about the fact that she did not know his name and he had not offered it. And for some reason this struck her as the most respectful thing that had happened to her in a very long time. They made Carver's Ford as the sun was dropping into the flat western line of the horizon, painting the sky the color of embers. The brace held the whole way, though she felt it flex twice on rough crossings, and her stomach had tightened both times. He rode at a steady distance off her left side, close enough to be present, far enough to not be hovering, and he said nothing for most of the 11 miles, which she found she appreciated enormously. Carver's Ford was not much of a town. A main street of packed dirt, a saloon, a general store, a small hotel that doubled as a boarding house, a livery stable, a smithy, and a scattering of houses that had the provisional look of structures still deciding whether to stay. But it had a wheelwright, she had been told, and the wheelwright's sign was still up when they rolled in at dusk, and the man himself was still at his forge when she pulled the wagon up to his door. She climbed down and looked at the man who had ridden beside her for 11 miles and did not yet know his name. "Thank you," she said. It came out plain and direct, and she meant it that way. He touched his hat brim. "Safe travels, ma'am." He turned the roan toward the livery. She watched him go for a moment, then turned to deal with the wheelwright, who had come to the door with grease on his apron and a lantern in his hand, and a look of professional assessment on his face as he regarded her wagon. "Heard you coming down the street," the wheelwright said. "That rear wheel's riding crooked." "I know," she said. "Someone repaired it on the trail. It held. I need a proper replacement." The wheelwright crouched and looked at the brace work in the lantern light and made a sound that she interpreted as grudging approval. "Decent field repair," he said. "Whoever did it knew what they were doing. Come back in the morning. I'll have your wheel done by noon." She thanked him and led her team to the livery and paid for their stabling, and then she stood in the cooling night air of Carver's Ford with $11.43 left to her name after paying for the livery, and her stomach was reminding her that she had not eaten since early morning. The hotel had a dining room. She could smell it from the street, something substantial and hot, bread and meat and coffee, and her 26-year-old body, which had been running on dried biscuits and determination since leaving Redemption Creek, responded to that smell with a kind of desperate longing that she chose not to think too hard about. She went inside and paid for a room and then sat down in the dining room, which held 4 tables and was lit by 2 oil lamps hung from the ceiling. There were a few other travelers eating. And there, at the table nearest the window, was the man with the creekwater eyes, eating alone, a plate of beef stew and a cup of coffee in front of him, his hat on the chair beside him, looking out at the dark street. She sat down at the table across from him, because it was the only other unoccupied table in the room, and the proprietor's wife, a stout woman named Mrs. Hendricks, who moved with the aggressive efficiency of someone who had fed strangers for 30 years, came and took her order. The man glanced at her and she glanced at him, and they both looked away with the particular courtesy of 2 people who have already spent time together in close proximity and are now recalibrating the distance. She ate her stew. He ate his stew. The other travelers talked among themselves. Outside, something in the street, a dog or a drunk man, hard to say, made occasional noise and was ignored. When her plate was nearly empty and her coffee was warm in her hands and the day's tension had begun to leave her shoulders in slow degrees, she looked across the room at him and said, "The stew is decent." "Better than I expected," he agreed. "I'm going to order more cornbread," she said. "If you haven't had any, you should. It's better than the stew." This was not quite an invitation and not quite a statement, and he seemed to understand it as whatever it needed to be. Mrs. Hendricks came back and Abigail ordered 2 plates of cornbread without asking, and when they arrived, she set one in front of herself and stood up and carried the other to his table and put it down in front of him and went back to her own table. He looked at the cornbread and then at her with an expression she couldn't quite read, and she said, "You fixed my wheel without asking permission. I fed you without asking your name. We'll call it even." Something shifted in his face then. Not quite a smile, something quieter than that, more internal, like a man recognizing something he had not expected to see. "That's fair," he said. She ate her cornbread. He ate his cornbread. Mrs. Hendricks brought more coffee without being asked, which Abigail felt was evidence of the woman's fundamental perceptiveness. "Frank Walker," he said after a while. She looked up. "My name," he said. She nodded. "Abigail Baker." "Where are you headed, Abigail Baker?" "Colorado," she said. "My father's cousin has a homestead claim outside a town called Millhaven. I've been told there's land available and work to be had." "Millhaven," he said, and something in his voice made her pay attention. "You know it? I came through it about 8 months ago," he said. "Decent enough place. Your father's cousin is that the Mercer family. There's a Mercer homestead about 4 miles north of town." "Elijah Mercer," she said, surprised. "You know him. I worked his fence line for 2 weeks last spring," Frank said. "Good man, straight with his pay. He's got a solid claim, good water, decent soil." "You work where you find work," she said. It was not quite a question. "I do," he said simply. There was no apology in it. She liked that. "What were you doing in Redemption Creek?" she asked. "Delivering horses," he said. "A rancher named Calloway hired me to bring a string of 6 from his brother's operation in Missouri. I delivered them, got paid, and now I'm going wherever seems reasonable." He paused. "I'm heading west, generally." She thought about that. She thought about a man who lived with no fixed point, who moved through the land like water finding its own level, belonging nowhere and therefore free everywhere. She thought about whether that was freedom or something else, loneliness with a different name. She did not say any of this. She said, "Good night, Mr. Walker," and took her coffee cup and went upstairs to her room, and she lay in the narrow hotel bed listening to the sounds of Carver's Ford settling into night horses in the livery, voices from the saloon, wind in the eaves. And she thought about Creekwater eyes and hands that knew how to fix things without being asked, and she fell asleep faster than she had in months. In the morning she went down to breakfast early and Frank Walker was already at the table by the window, and she sat down across the room again, and then, after a moment's consideration, moved to his table and sat across from him, and neither of them made any comment about this adjustment. Mrs. Hendricks brought eggs and salt pork and biscuits and coffee so strong it nearly had opinions, and they ate in the comfortable silence of 2 people who have already established that silence between them is not awkward. "I've been thinking," he said after a while. "About what?" "You're heading to Millhaven. I'm heading west." He picked up his coffee cup. "My west runs through Millhaven." She looked at him steadily. "You're offering to ride along." "I'm saying our directions are compatible," he said. "You're free to draw your own conclusion." She thought about this for a moment. The road to Millhaven from Carver's Ford was another 2.5 weeks of travel, depending on weather and conditions. It ran through territory that was not dangerous exactly. The worst of the Indian conflicts in southern Kansas had shifted further west, and the cavalry presence along the main trails had increased in the past 2 years. But it was empty country, long stretches of open plain where a woman traveling alone with a wagon was conspicuous, and occasionally invited the attention of men whose intentions she would rather not have to deal with. She had been prepared to handle it alone. She was almost always prepared to handle things alone. "Compatible directions," she said. "Fine." The wheelwright had the new wheel fitted by 10 in the morning, and she paid him from her carefully counted dollars. And Frank Walker was waiting by the livery when she brought the wagon out, the roan packed and ready, his bedroll tied neatly behind the saddle. He fell into the same position he had held the day before, slightly to her left, a comfortable distance, unhurrying, and they rolled out of Carver's Ford into the bright October morning, with the sky so wide and blue above them that it seemed almost aggressive in its expansiveness. They traveled steadily through the first day, making good miles on a flat stretch of trail that let the horses move at an easy pace. The land was showing the first colors of autumn. The grasses had gone from summer green to gold and brown, and the few trees that marked creek lines had taken on a warm amber that caught the afternoon light beautifully. Abigail found herself noticing this in a way she had not noticed landscape for some time, which she suspected had something to do with not being entirely alone in it. Frank rode and was quiet, but it was an inhabited quiet. She was aware of him in the way you were aware of a fire burning somewhere nearby, a warmth without being a disturbance. Occasionally he would say something, pointing out a landmark or noting a change in the trail, practical information offered without ceremony. Once he pulled ahead to check a creek crossing before she brought the wagon over, then waved her across when he found the bottom solid enough. They made camp at dusk beside a creek that had no name on any map she owned. She had a canvas tent she could rig from the wagon, and she set about doing this with practiced efficiency while Frank tended to both their horses, which she had not asked him to do, but which she found she did not object to, since the horses clearly recognized competence and were being handled well. He built a fire with the same unhurried economy that characterized everything he did, and she made coffee, and heated the beans she had brought from Carver's Ford, and sliced the bread that Mrs. Hendricks had pressed on her that morning with the conspiratorial air of a woman who knew something about the road ahead, and they sat on opposite sides of the fire and ate and drank coffee and watched the stars appear in the enormous Kansas sky. "How long have you been widowed?" he asked, and she looked up, startled not by the question but by the directness of it. 2 years, she said. "How did you know?" "The way you said my husband would have said the wagon was good for another decade," he said. "Past tense, and you handle everything like a woman who's been doing it alone for a while." She considered this. "His name was Thomas. He was a farmer. He was 30 years old when he died of a fever in the summer of 1872. He was a decent man." She paused. "We were not what you would call a great love story, Thomas and I, but he was decent and I respected him, and I was sorry when he died." She was not sure why she was telling him this. Perhaps because the fire made honesty easier, or because the dark all around them made it feel like words disappeared into the air rather than landing anywhere permanent. Or perhaps simply because he had asked in a way that seemed to actually want to know without agenda. "What about you?" she said. "No wife," he said. "I've been moving around since I was 18. Ranch work, trail driving, some freighting, some fence mending. A season cutting timber in Colorado." He looked into the fire. "I was born in Virginia. My family had a farm. The war took most of it and the men along with it. After that there wasn't much reason to stay." The war. She knew better than to ask which side this far into the 1870s, with the wound still capable of reopening if you pressed on it wrong. She simply nodded. "How old are you?" she asked. 31, he said. "You?" 26. They sat with the fire between them for a while, and the creek made its small noise nearby, and somewhere out in the grass a coyote expressed an opinion about the night. "Virginia farm boy turned drifter," she said finally. "Kansas widow turned pioneer," he said. Something about the exchange made her want to smile, and she did just slightly, and she saw him see it, and she looked back at her coffee cup. She slept in the wagon that first night, as she always did, the tent rigged as a kind of canopy over the wagon bed, and he slept rolled in his blanket near the dying fire, and in the morning she woke to find him already up and the horses already tended and coffee already made, and she climbed down from the wagon feeling more rested than she had felt in weeks. The days found their rhythm. They were on the trail by 7 each morning, she driving the wagon and he riding alongside, the Kansas land changing slowly beneath them as they moved west and slightly south, the flat plains beginning to develop a very gradual roll, the sky endlessly present overhead. They stopped at midday for water and a short rest, ate lunch from whatever she had packed or whatever they had been able to purchase at the small settlements they passed through, and made camp each evening with the practiced ease of people whose particular skills turned out to complement each other quite naturally. He shot a prairie chicken on the third day, appearing at the fire that evening with it already cleaned, and she roasted it over the coals with the dried herbs she kept in a tin box, and it was the best thing she had eaten since leaving Ohio, and she told him so, and he said that most of the credit belonged to the herbs. She began to understand over those first days that Frank Walker was a man who had lived so long in motion that stillness was almost foreign to him. He was always doing something useful, mending leather, sharpening a knife, checking the horses, studying the terrain ahead. But the doing was never restless. It was purposeful and calm, the way a river moved, always in motion but never in a hurry. She found this quality difficult to name but easy to appreciate. On the fourth evening, camped near a ridge of red limestone that caught the sunset and glowed like coals, she was washing the supper dishes at the creek when she heard him playing a harmonica somewhere behind her. She stopped what she was doing and listened. He was playing something slow, a melody she half recognized and could not name, something that felt like it belonged to a different place in time, Virginia, perhaps, or the years before the war, before whatever had happened that turned a farm boy into a man with no fixed address. It was not polished playing. It was honest playing, the kind that wasn't performed for anyone, just released into the air because it needed somewhere to go. She finished the dishes and walked back to the fire and sat down without commenting on the music, and after a moment he lowered the harmonica and the silence came back, and it was a different silence than before, warmer somehow. "You can keep playing," she said, "if you want." He played for another half hour, sitting on a rock on his side of the fire, and she sat on her side and mended a tear in her coat lining and listened, and it was one of the most pleasant evenings she could remember having in a very long time. The trouble came on the seventh day at a settlement called Becker's Crossing, which was less a town than an aspiration, a trading post, a rough stable, and 4 houses arranged around a muddy crossroads with an air of impermanence that seemed appropriate. They stopped for supplies, and while Frank took the horses to water and Abigail went into the trading post to purchase flour and salt and dried beans, she became aware of 2 men at the counter watching her with a particular quality of attention that she recognized and did not like. They were not remarkable men, dusty, trail-worn, one wearing a sheepskin coat with one missing button, the other with a beard that had stopped being intentional and started being neglect. But the way they tracked her movement through the store, and the way the sheepskin coat one spoke to his companion in a low voice with his eyes on her, these things registered in Abigail's mind with the specific alertness of a woman who had learned that ignoring these signals was a luxury she couldn't afford. She made her purchases efficiently and went out to the wagon, and as she was loading the supplies, the 2 men came out of the trading post behind her. "That's a fine team," Sheepskin Coat said, addressing the air somewhere near her but looking at the horses. "They're serviceable," she said, not looking up from the supplies. "You traveling alone?" "No," she said, a pause. "Don't see anyone else." "He's at the stable," she said, "and he'll be here in a moment." Sheepskin Coat moved a step closer, and his companion shifted to the other side of the wagon in a way that was meant to feel casual and did not. "Now there's no call to be unfriendly," Sheepskin Coat said. "We're just admiring your horses look good," Frank said. She looked up. He was coming from the direction of the stable, unhurried, leading both horses, his roan and the bay team. He met her eyes briefly, and then looked at the 2 men with the kind of calm, level attention that contained no aggression and no retreat. "Afternoon," he said to them, the same word he might have said to anyone. Sheepskin Coat looked at him for a moment, reading the same things Abigail had read the first day: the ease in the saddle, the competent hands, the absolute absence of anxiety, and whatever calculation he ran came out to a conclusion that motivated him to step back. "Afternoon," Sheepskin Coat said. And after a moment both men went back into the trading post, and that was the end of it. Frank hitched the bay team back to the wagon without any comment on what had just happened, and she climbed to the buckboard, and they left Becker's crossing at the same steady pace they had come in, and for about a mile neither of them spoke. "That happens," she said finally. "I know," he said. "I could have handled it." "I know you could have," he said. He was looking at the trail ahead, his voice as calm as always. "I was there anyway." She looked at the side of his face for a moment. "Thank you," she said. "You thanked me already," he said. "Once in Carver's Ford, I believe that covers quite a bit of ground." She laughed. It came out of her before she could think about whether to let it. A real laugh, not the polite, controlled version she had been producing socially for 2 years, but the actual thing. And it surprised her, and she suspected it surprised him too, because he glanced at her and something in his face changed in the way that happened when a person discovered something they had not expected to find. They made camp that night earlier than usual, because the sky had been building thunderheads all afternoon, and they wanted to get the tent properly rigged before the rain hit. They worked together to rig the canvas over the wagon, Frank holding the poles while she lashed the lines. And by the time the first fat drops began to fall, they had a reasonably weatherproof shelter over the wagon bed, and a smaller rigging for Frank's bedroll beneath the wagon. The rain came hard and fast, and then settled into a steady drumming, and they sat under the canvas with a single lantern between them, while the prairie rain swept over them in waves. Frank had his harmonica, and she had found that she had been keeping a small journal for the past year, mostly practical notes, distances traveled, supplies purchased, expenses, but sometimes other things, observations about the land or the weather or whatever was in her mind. "What are you writing?" he asked. "Just notes." "Notes about what?" she considered. "Everything. Today I wrote about the limestone ridge, yesterday, the color it turned at sunset. And before that I wrote about the prairie chickens we saw crossing the trail this morning, all in a line like they had somewhere important to be." He seemed to find this interesting. "Do you always write things down?" "Since Thomas died," she said. "I think I started because I needed somewhere to put things that didn't have anywhere else to go." She paused. "That sounds strange." "It doesn't," he said. She looked at him across the lantern. The rain was loud on the canvas and the night was very close around them, and she was aware of how small their circle of light was in all that darkness. "Where are you actually going?" she asked. "Not just west, specifically." He was quiet for a moment. "I'm not entirely sure," he said, with an honesty that seemed to cost him something small. "I've been meaning to get to Colorado for a while. I've heard there's good money in the mines if you don't mind the work, and I don't. And there's land opening up further north that's worth looking at." He turned the harmonica over in his hands. "I've been thinking for a while that I might want to stop moving at some point." "What would that look like?" she asked. "Stopping." "Some land," he said. "Something to build." A pause. "I don't know. It's been so long since I had a fixed point that I'm not sure I remember how to want one." She understood this more than she expected to. The fixed point she had had Thomas's farm. The life she had been building in Kansas had collapsed so completely that she was not entirely sure what she was building toward either. Colorado, Elijah Mercer's homestead, the vague possibility of land of her own, these were directions more than destinations. "I think sometimes you don't know what you're building toward until you're already building it," she said. He looked at her steadily. "That's true," he said. They sat in the rain noise until the fire went out entirely, and the lantern was the only warmth. And then she said good night and climbed into the wagon, and he settled under it. And the rain continued through the night with a steady generosity that would make the trail muddy in the morning but would also make the grass green another week longer. And she lay listening to it and feeling something she had not felt in a very long time, the specific, somewhat alarming sense of being interested in someone. Not interested the way you were interested in whether the weather would hold or the wheel repair would last, but interested the way that made you aware of yourself, of your own breathing, of the words you chose and their particular weight. She told herself this was the result of traveling alone for too long and finding unexpected company. She was almost convinced. The mud on the trail the next day was what she had expected, slowing the wagon and requiring Frank to ride ahead several times to test the road, and once requiring them both to put their shoulders against the wagon's back end, when the rear wheels sank past the hubs in a particularly soft stretch, and the horses could not pull it free without help. They both ended up mud-spattered and breathing hard, and when the wagon finally rolled free and they stood there looking at each other, both of them coated to the knee in red Kansas clay, she started laughing again, and this time he laughed too, and it sounded like something that had been waiting in him for a long time to get out. She would remember that, his laughter. It was not a performed sound. It was genuine and a little rusty, like something not often used, and it changed his whole face in a way that made her want to find more things to say that were worth laughing about. They cleaned up as best they could at the next creek crossing and dried off in the afternoon sun, while the trail firmed up under them. And by evening, they had made up the time the mud had cost them, and camped in a grove of cottonwoods along a creek that Frank said he remembered from his trip east 8 months ago. "I came through here in February," he said, looking around the grove with the particular expression of someone measuring what they remember against what they find. "There was ice on this creek. I camped here one night and it was cold enough that I didn't sleep much. And now it's warm," she said. "And now it's warm," he agreed and looked at her and looked away. These moments had been accumulating small exchanges that held more than their surface content, looks that lasted one beat longer than strictly necessary, the way he would sometimes speak and then stop, as if reconsidering what he had been about to say. She was aware of all of them the way you were aware of weather building, the pressure changing in the air. She was aware that she was not entirely opposed to the weather building. This was the part that required her to be careful, because Abigail Baker had learned from Ohio, from Thomas, from 2 years of Kansas frontier, and the particular education of surviving the loss of everything she had built, that being careful was not the same thing as being closed. She had confused those two things for a while after Thomas died. She had thought that keeping herself contained and self-sufficient was wisdom, and it was, partly. But it was also partly a wall, and walls that started as protection had a way of becoming prisons if you didn't check on them occasionally. She checked on hers, sitting by the cottonwood fire that night. She examined it honestly, the way she examined everything, the wheel, the supplies, the trail ahead. And she found that Frank Walker had, without apparent effort or intention, created several significant gaps in it simply by fixing things without being asked, and not requiring her to be grateful and laughing with a rusty genuineness in the mud. On the 12th day of travel, they came down into the broad river valley that marked the Colorado Territory boundary, and the landscape changed around them in a way that felt almost ceremonial. The flat Kansas plain giving way to rolling foothills, the sky developing a different quality of light, the air carrying a new coolness that tasted faintly of pine and altitude. Abigail stood up on the buckboard to see better, holding the reins loosely, and Frank pulled his horse alongside her, and they both looked at the mountains that had appeared on the western horizon, blue and enormous, and so clean against the sky that they seemed almost painted. "The first time I saw them," Frank said quietly, "I didn't believe they were real. I thought I was imagining them." She understood exactly what he meant. She had grown up with Ohio hills, gentle and wooded. Kansas had taken away even those. The Rockies were something else entirely, a wall at the edge of the world, or more accurately, evidence that the world was larger than anything Ohio had prepared her for. "They're real," she said, for both of them. "They're real," he agreed. They were 3 days from Millhaven by Frank's reckoning, and the trail through the valley was good, dry and well-traveled, with small settlements appearing more frequently now that they were in Colorado territory. At one of these, a proper little town called Sutter's Mill Crossing, not to be confused with the more famous California location of the same name. She bought fresh bread and dried fruit, and he bought grain for the horses, and they ate lunch at an actual table outside a small eating establishment while the horses rested. Sitting across a table from him in actual daylight, with the town noise around them and people passing on the street, she was struck by how comfortable the arrangement had become. Not comfortable the way furniture was comfortable, familiar to the point of invisibility, but comfortable the way a good conversation was comfortable, where you stopped monitoring yourself and simply were. She had not been this comfortable with Thomas in 3 years of marriage. She had been fond of Thomas, and she had respected him, but she had always been slightly aware of herself around him, as if some essential part of her was holding something back without quite knowing why. She was not holding anything back with Frank Walker. Or rather, she was being careful, being measured, but it was a different kind of holding back. Not concealment, but consideration. The difference between a woman who couldn't say what she meant and a woman who was choosing the right moment. "You went quiet," he said. "I was thinking. About the fact that I don't do this," she said. "Do what?" She gestured slightly at the table at him, at whatever the two of them had been for the past 2 weeks. "This," she said. He was quiet for a moment. "Neither do I," he said. "Normally." "What does that mean?" "It means I've been traveling with you for 12 days and talking with you every evening, and I can't think of a single moment I wanted to be somewhere else." He said this simply, with the directness she had noticed in him from the first day, the quality of a man who didn't say things he didn't mean. "That's not normal for me. I'm usually counting the miles to the next place." She looked at the table. She looked up at him. "We have 3 more days to Millhaven," she said. "I know," he said. "And then what?" He held her gaze. "I don't know yet," he said, "but I find I'm in no hurry to decide." She understood this as the truth it was, not evasion but honesty about a thing that was still in the process of becoming clear, and she respected it accordingly. She did not push. She picked up her coffee cup, and he picked up his, and they sat in the Colorado sunshine with the mountains white on the horizon, and said nothing else about it. And the nothing else felt full rather than empty. The last 3 days were slower than the first 12, partly because the trail through the foothills required more attention, steeper grades, narrower paths along canyon edges, the occasional stretch where she needed to walk beside the horses and guide them rather than drive from the seat, and partly because she found herself in no particular hurry to arrive. Millhaven and Elijah Mercer's homestead were a next step, and she believed in the next step. But the road to the next step had turned out to contain things she had not expected, and she was not entirely ready to leave the road for the destination. They had their first real disagreement on the 14th day, on a matter of such practical insignificance that it was almost funny in retrospect. She wanted to take the main canyon road, which was the established route. Frank wanted to take a cutoff through a lower valley that he said would save 4 miles. She pointed out that she had no map of the cutoff and no knowledge of its condition. He pointed out that he had come through it in February and knew the road well. She said February conditions and October conditions were not necessarily the same. He said she was right, but that the main canyon road had a particular grade on the north side that was going to be hard on the wagon's newly replaced wheel. They argued about it for about 10 minutes with actual heat, not anger exactly, but the kind of friction that happens when 2 competent, decided people with different information arrive at the same decision point. She was not used to being argued with, partly because she had been alone for 2 years and partly because Thomas had largely deferred to her on practical matters in a way she had appreciated at the time, but now recognized as a particular form of absence. Frank did not defer. He said what he thought and he meant it, and he expected her to engage with it. She engaged with it. She laid out her reasoning and he laid out his, and in the end they took the cutoff because his argument was actually better, which she told him while they were taking it, and he said he knew, which made her want to argue with him again about something just for the pleasure of it. The cutoff was better. The valley road was smooth and the grade was easy, and the wheel, which she had been watching with some concern, showed no sign of strain. When they came out of the valley onto the last stretch of trail before Millhaven, she said, "You were right," and he said. "You knew that after the first 5 minutes," and she said. "I was still thinking it through," and he said. "That's fair." And she thought that those two words, "that's fair," might be the phrase she associated most with him, the one he returned to, the one that seemed to contain his whole approach to the world. Millhaven appeared on the afternoon of the 15th day, tucked into a wide valley between two long ridgelines, the mountains proper visible to the west as a constant presence, their peaks already showing snow against the brilliant blue sky. It was a real town, larger than anything she had seen since Redemption Creek, a main street of proper storefronts, a church with an actual steeple, a school, a railroad depot at the edge of town that spoke of real connection to the wider world. The population, she had been told, was somewhere around 800 souls, a mix of mining families, ranching families, and the miscellaneous population that gathered around any place where work and water and the promise of something were available. She felt the town ahead of her like a new chapter beginning, and the sensation was complex anticipation mixed with something that was almost reluctance, because she had not yet resolved what was behind her on the road. They rode into town together, wagon and rider, through streets that held the late afternoon activity of a working community, women on the boardwalks with baskets, men in front of the hardware store, children running between the buildings with the absolute commitment to purposeless velocity that seemed to be the universal occupation of children everywhere. Abigail navigated toward the center of town, looking for a boarding house or hotel, and Frank rode beside her in his customary position. "Elijah Mercer's place is 4 miles north," he said. "I know," she said. "I'll go tomorrow. Tonight I want a proper bath and a real bed." "That's reasonable," he said. She found the Millhaven Hotel on the main street, a 2-story frame building painted white with green trim that was ambitious by frontier standards. She pulled the wagon up and climbed down, and Frank tied his horse and helped her unload the things she would need for the night from the wagon. Standing on the boardwalk with her travel bag at her feet and the cedar chest of her grandmother's dishes still locked in the wagon bed and the mountain evening cooling around them, she looked at Frank Walker and he looked at her, and the distance between them felt both necessary and frustrating. "Where will you stay?" she asked. "There's another boarding house down by the depot," he said. "I saw the sign," she nodded. She wanted to say something that was equal to the 2 weeks behind them, something that acknowledged what had accumulated between them on the trail, but the words for that kind of thing were difficult and she had not had much practice with them. "Frank," she said. "Abigail," he said. "Thank you," she said, "for the wheel and for Becker's Crossing and for all the rest of it." He was quiet for a moment. The street noise moved around them. The mountains were turning pink in the sunset. "I'll be in Millhaven for a few days," he said, "before I figure out what's next." Something that might have been relief went through her. "I'll be at Elijah Mercer's," she said. "If you come north." His face did the thing it had done the first night with the cornbread, that small internal shift, the recognition of something unexpected. "I'll find my way there," he said. She picked up her bag and went inside, and she did not look back, and it took considerable effort. Elijah Mercer turned out to be exactly what Frank had said, a good man, straight and honest, with a broad, weathered face and a warm handshake, and a wife named Clara who had Abigail sitting at a real kitchen table with real coffee and real pie within 20 minutes of her arrival the next afternoon, and who said nothing at all about the fact that Abigail arrived with mud on her boots and the particular look of a person who had been sleeping outdoors for 2 weeks. The homestead was solid and real, a proper house, 2 barns, good fencing, a kitchen garden still producing late-season greens, a small apple orchard that had been planted 5 years ago and was beginning to deliver on its promise. The land around it was beautiful in a way that made Ohio look small, wide meadows backed by foothills, a creek running through the property, the mountains so close now that they filled the western sky entirely. Elijah took her around the property the next morning, showing her what he had built and what still needed building, and he told her about the land claim adjacent to his own 80 acres of good soil, the previous claimant having abandoned it after a failed first season, available for filing with the land office in Millhaven at no charge to anyone willing to put in the work. 80 acres. She stood in the field that was the heart of the adjacent claim and turned in a circle and looked at the mountains and the meadow and the creek that cut through the far corner, and she thought about what Frank had said about wanting to stop moving at some point. She thought about the gaps in her wall. Frank came north on the third day, as she had not quite let herself expect and completely expected anyway. He rode up the lane to Elijah's house in the mid-morning, and Elijah shook his hand with the recognition of a man who had employed him and found him worth employing. And Clara fed him lunch, and then he asked if Abigail wanted to walk the adjacent land claim with him, because he had heard from Elijah about it and thought she should have a second opinion before filing at the land office. She walked the 80 acres with him in the October sunshine, the dead grass crackling under their boots, the mountains enormous and white above them, the creek chattering over its stones in the far corner. He looked at the soil and the water situation and the exposure, and said it was good land, that the abandoned claim was more a story about a man who gave up too soon than about bad ground, and that someone who knew how to work and was willing to be patient with a first season would do well here. "Someone like me," she said. "Someone exactly like you," he said. They were standing at the far edge of the property near the creek, and the land spread back toward Elijah's homestead on one side and open Colorado territory on the other, and the quiet was enormous and clean. "I'm going to file the claim," she said. "Tomorrow." "I know," he said. He was looking at the creek. "Frank." He turned and looked at her, and she held his gaze. "What are you going to do?" she asked. He was quiet for what felt like a long time. "There's work at the Millhaven mining operation," he said. "A foreman position. Elijah told me about it this morning. A man who can manage equipment and oversee a work crew. I've done both." "That's not what I asked," she said. He looked at her with the creekwater eyes that had been looking at her honestly for 2 weeks, and she saw him deciding to stop being careful. "What I want to do," he said, "is stay." She felt something in her chest settle like a wheel finding its proper seating. "Then stay," she said. "Abigail, I'm not a woman who says things she doesn't mean, Frank Walker. I'm telling you to stay. I'm not telling you where or how that has to look. I'm telling you that this," she gestured at the land at him, "at the space between them seems worth staying for." He took the step between them that removed the last of the polite traveling distance, and he took her hand from where it hung at her side, and he held it in his rough, capable, wheel-fixing hands, and he looked at her. "I don't know how to do this," he said. "Staying, I've forgotten what it looks like." "I don't know how to do it either," she said. "I've never done it by choice, only by circumstance." She looked at their joined hands. "We could figure it out together." He raised her hand and turned it slightly and pressed his lips to the back of it, a gesture so old-fashioned and unself-conscious that it went straight through all her careful defenses and found the thing underneath. "Together," he said. "Yes." They stood in the October field with the mountains watching and the creek making its small patient sound, and if the land around them had opinions about this development, it kept them to itself. Abigail filed the land claim at the Millhaven land office on the following Monday morning, signing her name, Abigail Baker, in the register with a pen that scratched and a hand that was perfectly steady. The land office clerk, a young man with spectacles and an earnest manner, recorded the claim, stamped the paperwork, and congratulated her on a fine piece of ground. She walked out into the Millhaven morning with 80 acres of Colorado territory belonging to her name, and felt something she had been working toward for a long time without being entirely sure it was what she was working toward. Frank was waiting outside on the boardwalk, having waited while she handled the transaction alone, because he understood that this was hers to do alone. "Done," she said. "Congratulations," he said, and offered his hand, and she shook it. And then she laughed at the formality of it, and he laughed too. And then they were just standing there laughing on the boardwalk in Millhaven, Colorado territory in the autumn of 1874, with the mountains above them and the future in front of them. and it was the best she had felt in years. Frank took the foreman position at the Millhaven mining operation, which required him in town 3 days a week, and gave him the rest of the time to help Abigail begin the work of the claim. He found lodgings in town for the nights he was needed there, and on the other days he rode north to the homestead and put his hands to whatever needed doing, and what needed doing was considerable. The abandoned claim had good bones but neglect to address. The small house that the previous claimant had built 2 rooms, a loft, a stone chimney that had been laid with some competence, needed a new roof section on the south end, several window repairs, and a thorough cleaning that took Abigail 2 full days of determined effort. The kitchen garden had gone completely to seed, but the soil under it was rich and would be ready for planting come spring. A section of the fence line had fallen in the fall wind and needed rebuilding. They worked on these things together on his days north, and sometimes Elijah and Clara came to help, and sometimes neighboring homesteaders that Abigail was beginning to know stopped to offer a hand in the way of frontier communities where self-sufficiency and neighborly support were not contradictions, but different aspects of the same survival strategy. A man named Douglas Hale and his wife, Ruth, helped re-roof the south section and stayed for supper. And Ruth, who was a forthright woman of 40 with a sharp eye and a direct manner that Abigail found refreshing, looked at Frank across the table and then looked at Abigail and said nothing, but her expression said quite a lot. After supper, when Douglas and Ruth had gone and Frank was banking the fire in the repaired stone hearth, Ruth's expression still present in the air somewhere, Abigail said, "She thinks we're courting." Frank looked up from the fire. "She has good instincts," he said. Abigail sat down in the chair near the hearth, her chair in her house on her land, none of which she had expected to be able to say at the beginning of October. "Is that what we're doing?" He straightened up and turned to look at her, the firelight doing interesting things to his face. "I would like it to be what we're doing," he said. "I told you I wanted to stay. I don't think I was just talking about Colorado." She held his gaze. "I would like it to be that too," she said. "Though I should tell you that I am not the easiest person to—" "I know," he said. "I was going to say I'm not the easiest person to be around," she said. "I know that too," he said. "I've been around you for a month. I know you'll argue when you think you're right, and you'll be quiet when you're thinking, and you'll say thank you exactly once for any given thing and not again, and you keep a journal about prairie chickens and limestone ridges, and you make better coffee than anyone I've met in 10 years of traveling." He paused. "I'm still here." She looked at him for a moment. Then she said, "Well then." He came to her side of the fire and crouched down to her level, which put him at eye contact, and he took her hands in both of his and held them with a steadiness that she had come to understand was simply the quality of him, solid and present and not going anywhere. "Abigail Baker," he said, "I would like to court you, plainly and honestly, in full view of everyone, including Douglas and Ruth Hale, and I would like to do it with the intention that it leads somewhere permanent." She felt the warmth of his hands and the warmth of the fire and the warmth of the words, all of it together. "That is the most direct courtship proposal I have ever heard," she said. "I'm a direct man," he said. "You are," she agreed. "Yes, Frank Walker, you may court me." He raised her hands again and kissed them, and this time it was not the formal, careful gesture on the field but something warmer, and he stayed crouched by her chair for a moment with his forehead resting briefly against her hands, and she sat very still and let herself receive this without analyzing it, which was progress. November came to the Colorado Valley in a series of beautiful clear days followed by the first real cold, frost on the grass in the mornings, and wood smoke coming from every chimney in the valley. Abigail had the house properly habitable by mid-month, not comfortable exactly, not yet, but functional and hers, with her grandmother's dishes on the shelf she had built along the kitchen wall and her cedar chest at the foot of the bed in the main room, and her journal on the small table by the window where she could write while looking at the mountains. She wrote about Frank frequently. She recorded things he said and things she observed about him, and the way the work of the land was going between them, and she recognized, reading back over these entries, that her writing had changed since Carver's Ford. Before, in the Kansas entries, it was almost purely observational, the journal of a woman recording the external world with the careful precision of someone who was not quite ready to look inward. Now there was interiority. There was feeling named plainly on the page. It seemed like evidence of something. Frank proposed marriage on the 15th of December, which was a Saturday, in the early evening on the porch of her house, with the mountains showing the last blue light and the first stars appearing above the peaks. He had been at the homestead all day, helping her dig out a root cellar that she had been wanting since the first frost, and they were both tired and dirty and had eaten supper at her table, and they were sitting on the porch with coffee because the evening was cold but not yet bitter and the sky was extraordinary. He said, "I've been thinking about this since somewhere around the 10th day on the trail. I've been not saying it because I wanted to be sure, and I am sure. I love you, Abigail Baker, and I would like to marry you and help you build this place and stay here with you for the rest of my life if you'll have me." She set down her coffee cup very carefully because her hands were not entirely steady. "No drifting," she said. She had to be sure about this. "No drifting," he said firmly. "I'm done with it. I have been since somewhere around the creekside camp with the limestone ridge, maybe before that if I'm honest." "You're always honest," she said. "As much as I can be," he said. "Yes." She looked at the mountains that had become hers over the past 2 months, familiar now in the way that the things you loved became familiar, not less beautiful for the familiarity, but more so. She thought about the wheel on the Kansas trail, cracked clean in half, which had seemed like the universe's personal grudge and now seemed like something else entirely. "I love you too," she said. She said it plainly, the way she said everything without decoration, meaning every syllable. "And yes, yes, Frank." He put his arm around her on the porch, and she leaned into him, and they watched the last light leave the mountains together. And it was the simplest and most complete thing she had experienced in her life. They were married in February of 1875, in the Millhaven church with the proper steeple, on a cold, bright day with snow on the ground and sun turning everything to silver. Elijah Mercer walked her down the aisle because he was the nearest thing to family she had in Colorado, and Clara Mercer cried with a wholehearted generosity that made several other attendees follow suit. Ruth and Douglas Hale were there, and the mining operations manager and his wife, and a good portion of the valley community that had been watching the whole thing develop with the particular satisfaction of people who enjoyed watching good things happen. Frank Walker in his good clothes, the suit he had purchased at the Millhaven dry goods store with 3 weeks of foreman's pay, dark wool, properly fitted, a white shirt and a simple tie, looked like a man who had arrived at something he had been traveling toward without knowing it, and she told him so afterward, and he said she was the most beautiful thing he had ever seen, which was not a thing he said for effect, but because it was what he thought. She wore her best dress, a dark blue wool that she had made herself in the weeks before the wedding, and her hair properly up, and she carried the dried wildflowers that Clara had put together because real flowers in February in Colorado were wishful thinking, and she walked down that aisle on Elijah's arm feeling lighter than she had in years, not because the weight of the past 2 years was gone, but because she was carrying it now in the company of someone who would carry some of it with her. The minister, a sensible man named Reverend Thorne, who had clearly conducted many frontier weddings, and understood that brevity and clarity were the virtues most appropriate to the setting, pronounced them married in a ceremony that was brief and genuine and completely satisfying. The reception afterward at Elijah and Clara's house was the best kind of frontier celebration food in quantities that required 3 tables pushed together, music from a fiddler named Pete who knew 40 songs and played them all with equal enthusiasm, dancing that went on until well past what anyone had intended, and the kind of warmth that happened when a community decided to celebrate fully. Frank danced with her twice, which was all the propriety of 1875 Colorado required, and each time he held her with the same steadiness he brought to everything, and she felt the reality of the thing settle around her like a coat, that she was his wife and he was her husband, and that was permanent now, not the careful contingent arrangement of the trail or the provisional understanding of the courtship, but something fixed as the mountains. They went home to their house that evening, and the fire was still warm from the morning, and Frank built it back up while she unpinned her hair and hung up her blue dress, and they sat together on the rug in front of the fire with the whole quiet night around them, and the mountains somewhere out there in the dark holding their snow and their permanence. "Well," he said. "Well," she said. He put his arm around her and she leaned against him, and she felt his hand rest on her hair with a gentleness that was one of the things she had come to love most about him. This careful, deliberate gentleness in a man who had lived a hard life in a hard country and had not let it make him hard. "Still sure," he said. There was warmth in it, not doubt. "More than ever," she said. They had their first season on the land together in the spring of 1875, and it was everything a first season was, backbreaking and uncertain and occasionally disheartening, and also magnificent, in the particular way that working your own land was magnificent. They planted the kitchen garden and a grain field in the lower meadow, and a small kitchen orchard of apple and pear trees that would take years to produce, but would be there for the years after that. And Frank built a proper barn over the spring and summer with help from Douglas Hale and Elijah Mercer, and 2 other neighbors from the valley, a raising that involved a great deal of work and an equal amount of food and laughter. Frank kept the foreman position at the mine for the first year, which gave them a reliable income while the land found its feet. But by the following spring, the homestead was producing well enough that he gave it up, and they were fully committed to the land, which was what they had both wanted. The first summer was dry but not ruinously so, and the grain came in at a yield that made Elijah nod with satisfaction, and made Frank sit on the porch that evening with his coffee and look at the field, with an expression that Abigail had learned to recognize the look of a man who had spent so long expecting to leave that staying still surprised him, and who was learning to be surprised by it pleasantly. She had kept writing in her journal all through it. The wedding, the spring planting, the barn raising, the first harvest, the way he looked at the mountains in the morning before the day started, the particular sound of him singing quietly while he worked, just fragments of songs, nothing he probably meant to share but which drifted through open windows and into her awareness and became, without her planning it, one of the textures of home. In the early autumn of 1875, she told him she was expecting. He was at the kitchen table when she told him, eating breakfast, the morning light coming through the east window the way it did, and she said it plainly because she said everything plainly, and he put down his coffee cup and looked at her with an expression that moved through several things: surprise, a kind of deep absorption, and then something that opened up in his face like a window opening, pure and unguarded. He stood up from the table and crossed to her and took both her hands and held them the way he had on the field when they first talked about staying steady and real, and he said, "Abigail," and that was all he said for a moment, just her name, but the way he said it contained everything. "How are you feeling?" he said. "Good," she said. "Tired in the mornings, but good." He brought his forehead down to rest against hers, and she felt the warmth of him and the reality of the moment. This house they had built, this land they had claimed, this person she had found on a broken road in Kansas who had fixed a wheel without asking permission and stayed for everything else. Their son was born in the spring of 1876, the last weeks of April when the snow was leaving the higher meadows, and the creek was running full and musical with the snowmelt. And he was a healthy and remarkably loud individual who announced his arrival into the world with an enthusiasm that impressed even Clara Mercer, who had been present at a considerable number of births. They named him James Elijah Walker, the first name Frank's father's name, which had been waiting quietly in him for a reason to use it, and the second name Elijah Mercer's, which made Elijah go immediately outside when they told him, ostensibly to check on something, and returned 5 minutes later with red eyes and the air of a man who had absolutely not been emotional about it. James was a brown-eyed, dark-haired baby who looked predominantly like his father, which Abigail had expected based on the mathematical probability of two brown-eyed parents. He slept in a cradle that Frank had built during the winter, made from the same oak that had served as the wheel brace on the Kansas Trail. She had told him this was coincidence, and he had said he didn't think so, which was one of the more poetic things she had ever heard him say. The valley life settled around them with the particular richness of a life built from scratch and chosen deliberately. Frank was known in the valley community as a solid man, good with his hands, reliable in a crisis, and possessed of an evenness of temper that made him someone people turned to when things needed sorting out. He became, almost without trying, one of those men that a frontier community organized itself around, not a leader by ambition, but a center of gravity by character. Abigail was known as the woman who had come alone from Kansas with a broken wagon and a direct manner, which she considered an accurate enough summary. She was on good terms with the other women of the valley and somewhat better friends with Ruth Hale and Clara Mercer, who were women of a similar self-sufficiency that she respected. She kept her journal, and she kept her land with equal care, and the land responded. The apple orchard produced its first real fruit in the autumn of 1877, and she stood in it on an October morning that was very like the October mornings of the Kansas Trail, and picked an apple from the branch and ate it standing there, and it tasted like 3 years of patience. Frank came out to the orchard to find her and took an apple himself and ate it next to her, and they stood in the small orchard with the mountains above them and the valley spread below, the morning light clean and cold on everything. "We planted these," she said. "We did," he agreed. "They're good. They're very good." He looked at the trees with their October gold leaves and their remaining fruit, and then at her with the same quality of attention he had always given her, that genuine, unperforming interest. "Do you ever think about Kansas?" she considered. "Sometimes. I think about the trail sometimes. I think about the limestone ridge." She looked at the mountains. "I think the ridge prepared me for these." "Is that all you think about the trail?" he said with a careful casualness that she saw straight through. "No," she said. "I think about a man who fixed my wheel without asking permission." "That was a good wheel repair," he said. "It was an excellent wheel repair," she agreed. "It got me here." He put his arm around her waist and she leaned into him, and the orchard held them both in its October morning, and behind them through the house window she could hear James, 2 years old and entirely committed to noise, engaged in the mysterious enterprise of being young and alive. In the autumn of 1878, Abigail discovered she was expecting again, and this time the tiredness in the mornings was accompanied by a certainty she couldn't have explained logically that something was different. The pregnancy felt different from James's, and Clara Mercer, who had come to have a kind of practical wisdom about these things, said that every pregnancy felt different and that Abigail should not read too much into it. A daughter was born in May of 1879, at the end of a long and hard labor that Abigail bore with the grim determination she brought to every difficult thing. And Clara Mercer was there again, and Frank was in the next room being utterly useless and deeply present. And when it was finally done, and Clara brought him the baby, a small girl with her mother's dark eyes and her father's determined jaw. Frank Walker sat in the chair beside Abigail's bed and held the baby and looked at her with an expression that Abigail would record in her journal that evening, as the face of a man who understood, perhaps for the first time completely, what staying felt like from the inside. They named her Clara Ruth Walker, the first name for Clara Mercer and the second for Ruth Hale, and both women accepted the honor with the slightly undone dignity of people given a gift they hadn't expected and weren't sure how to hold. James, who was 3, regarded his sister with the cautious assessment of someone encountering an unexpected development, and eventually decided she was acceptable, which Clara Mercer said was the most diplomatic 3-year-old response to a sibling's arrival she had ever witnessed. The years moved through the valley with the steady pace of seasons in a mountain community: spring planting, summer work, autumn harvest, winter repair and planning, and the particular closeness that the cold and the snow and the shortened days created. The homestead grew: a second barn, a proper chicken house, a smokehouse that Frank built in the winter of 1879, the grain field expanded, and a small hay meadow put into production to carry the animals through the hard winters. Frank had a reputation by now in Millhaven as a man worth consulting on matters of land and machinery, and he served 2 terms on the town council in the early 1880s, which he did without enjoying the politics, but with the reliability that led people to keep asking him. He turned down a 3rd term in 1882 because James was 6 and Clara Ruth was 3, and he said he had more important work at home, which the council accepted with reluctant understanding. Abigail had written several pieces for the Millhaven Gazette, the town's newspaper, that had begun publication in 1878, observations about the land, about the seasons, about the particular challenges and rewards of homestead life. The editor, a man named Garrett who wore wire-rimmed spectacles and had come west from Philadelphia with a printing press and an editorial ambition, told her she wrote with an honesty and precision that his other contributors rarely achieved, and asked if she would consider a regular column. She said she would consider it and eventually agreed, and her column appeared twice a month through the early 1880s under her full name, Abigail Walker, though she kept Baker in the journal, because it was the name she had carried through the hard years, and it felt important to keep it somewhere. One evening in the autumn of 1883, Frank found her at the small table by the window where she had always written, and he had been in the field all day, and he came in with the smell of autumn earth on him, and he put his hands on her shoulders and read what she was writing over her shoulder. It was an entry about the apple orchard, about the morning light and the taste of the first fruit, about patience. "You wrote about the orchard before," he said. "I write about it every year," she said. "Every year differently. Every year it's different," she said. "Every year there are more apples." He bent down and kissed the top of her head, the way he had for 8 years now, as natural and necessary as the morning coffee and the evening fire, and she felt the constancy of him in it, this man who had known how to leave and had chosen to stay, who had fixed things without being asked, and who she had fed without knowing his name, and with whom she had built, carefully and deliberately, a life that fit them both precisely. James was 7 in 1883, and Clara Ruth was 4, and the homestead was solid and producing, and known through the valley as one of the better-run operations in the region. The mountains that had seemed so impossible on that first October afternoon were simply home now, as familiar as Frank's face and as necessary as the creek water. She closed her journal that evening with the sense she often had in writing, that the words were insufficient for the thing they were trying to hold, but that the trying mattered, that putting the words down was its own kind of preservation. She looked out the window at the mountains in their evening blue and thought about a wheel breaking on a Kansas trail, about a man who appeared on a roan horse and fixed things quietly and was still here, 9 years later, with his hands on her shoulders and his boots at the door and his harmonica on the shelf where it had lived since they moved into the house together. "Frank," she said. He was at the hearth, building the evening fire. He looked up. "I'm glad the wheel broke," she said. He was quiet for a moment, the same way he was always quiet when something mattered, absorbing it fully before responding. Then he said, "So am I." She turned back to the window. Outside, in the last light, she could see the apple trees, bare now for winter but alive, deeply and permanently rooted in the ground she had claimed in 1874, the ground she had arrived at through a broken wheel and a stranger's capable hands and the long road west, and she felt the particular completeness of a life that had arrived, against considerable odds, at exactly where it needed to be. The Christmas of 1883 was the kind that the valley would talk about for years afterward. The snow came early and heavy and beautiful, transforming the mountains and the meadows into something so purely white that it seemed less real than a painting of the idea of winter. And the homestead was warm with fire and children, and the neighbors who came and went through the holiday weeks with the generosity of community. Ruth and Douglas Hale came for Christmas dinner and brought their children, 3 of them now. And Elijah and Clara came, and Elijah's beard was going gray now, and Clara had more silver in her hair than brown, but they were both thoroughly themselves, solid and warm and present. Pete the fiddler came with his fiddle and played for 2 hours while the children danced, and the adults watched them and drank spiced cider, and the house was full of a noise that was purely joyful. Frank played his harmonica alongside Pete for a few songs, the reedier sound weaving in and out of the fiddle's bright voice, and Abigail stood near the hearth with her cider and watched him play and thought about the campfire on the Kansas Trail, the first time she had heard the music, how it had seemed to come from somewhere private in him that he was releasing carefully into the dark air. He caught her watching and lowered the harmonica and held her gaze across the room full of people, and she saw in his face the same thing she always saw there. The steadiness, the honesty, the particular quality of a man who was exactly where he intended to be, and she raised her cider cup in a small private toast, and he understood it completely and smiled, and the smile was still not performed, still that genuine, slightly rusty thing that she had found in the mud outside Becker's Crossing and had been finding ever since. James came to stand beside her, tall for 7 years and serious in the way of children who pay attention, and leaned against her side. "Why is Papa smiling at you like that?" he asked. "Because he's happy," she said. "What's he happy about?" "Everything," she said. She put her arm around her son's shoulders and he let her, not yet old enough to find this undignified. "He's happy about everything." Outside, the Colorado snow fell on the mountains and the valley and the homestead and the apple orchard, falling steadily and generously on everything alike, covering the broken places and the fixed ones equally, making the whole valley one white, quiet, impermanent-looking and entirely permanent thing. In the spring of 1884, the creek ran high with the snowmelt, and the meadows greened early, and the apple trees bloomed in the second week of May, with a density of blossom that promised another good crop come fall. Frank and Abigail walked the orchard together on the morning the blossoms fully opened, James running ahead of them down the rows and Clara Ruth toddling with absolute determination at his heels, and the mountains were blue above them and the blossoms were white below, and the world for that morning was simply and completely exactly what it was. "I've been thinking," Abigail said. "About what?" he said, the question that had traveled with them since Carver's Ford. "About how far we've come from the Kansas Trail," she said, "and how strange it is that any of it happened." He took her hand as they walked, the same steady hands that had braced a cracked wheel 10 years ago on a dirt road in the middle of nowhere, hands that had built a barn and planted grain and rocked a baby and played a harmonica in the dark and held her hands on a cold December porch when he asked her to be his wife. "It happened because you were on the trail," he said, "and I was on the trail. And a wheel broke." "That's a modest account," she said. "The important parts are modest," he said. "The important parts are just being in the right place when something needs doing." She looked at him, this man who had fixed her wheel without asking permission, with whom she had built a life and raised 2 children, and planted an orchard and put down roots so deep into the Colorado ground that she could not now imagine being anything other than here, now, this. And she felt the fullness of it, the specific completed weight of a life that had arrived at something whole. "Well," she said, stopping in the middle of the orchard row while the children ran on ahead and the blossoms fell slowly around them in the light morning breeze, "then I am very glad you were in the right place." He stopped with her. He turned to face her, and the morning light was on both of them, and the mountains were behind him, and she was looking at the face she knew best in the world. "So am I," he said, "every single day." He kissed her in the apple orchard while the blossoms fell and the children hollered somewhere up ahead, and the creek ran its bright noise through the morning, and the mountains were unchanged, and the land was theirs, and the life they had built between them was real and permanent and full. And Abigail Baker Walker, who had learned not to need things and then learned something better, held onto her husband's hands and let herself have all of it. The orchard and the mountains and the two children and the man who had stayed, all of it, with both hands, for as long as it lasted, which she intended to make as long as possible. The wheel had broken on a Tuesday afternoon in the autumn of 1874, and she had said a word her mother would not have approved of, and a stranger on a roan horse had come down the trail and fixed it without asking permission, and she had fed him without asking his name, and they had called it even, and nothing about any of it had been even at all. It had been the beginning of everything.